How many of you here, I want to ask a question if we start today. How many of you here can tell a fish story? Anybody have a fish story? I'll bet y'all do. You know, it's kind of universal amongst men. I don't know so much about women, but some of them do. Some of you ladies have been fishing. The best fish story I know is when I was about 10, 11 years old. I used to sit on the porch and listen to my two uncles, Bill and Harley, and my father, Bob, although I wasn't allowed to call him that. To me, he was either Dad or Robert. But those numbskull cousins of mine called him Bob. They would try and, those were the three, like I've told you before, those are the three biggest liars that God ever assembled in one place. In fact, when I buried Harley, he was the biggest of them all. I told stories of all, for his eulogy was nothing but his stories. And people that were there remembered and said, "Oh, I remember that one." Well, they were telling fish stories one day, and Harley was talking about how he went deep sea fishing. That was a big deal for him. He's a rancher, a cowboy, and you know he's not on the water too much, but he went deep sea fishing and fought for 2.5 hours, and he landed a swordfish, a big old giant swordfish, couple of 100 pounds, 3 hours struggling, pulling that thing in, pulling that thing. Well, then he kind of brought his hat down and put it to rest. Well, Bill's not going to be outdone by that. So Bill was talking about, yeah, that's nothing. I was over in the Gulf in a little rowboat, 8 foot, which is a crock. 8-foot boat, and I latched onto a 400-pound tarpon. And I fought that thing. It dragged me all the way to Acapulco before I got that thing in a boat. And I got that thing in a boat, and it was 6 times longer than a boat. And it was so huge, and I brought that in. And, we're going, oh, man, what a crock. Well, Bob, ain't you got nothing to say? Now, my father was very cool. He was an attorney and a judge, and he listened. Then he said, yeah, I went fishing one. Up in the North Atlantic, actually, just after the war. And I was fishing out there, and I hooked onto something. I didn't know what it was. And I pulled, and it pulled, and I pulled, and it pulled, and we pulled, and pulled, and pulled. It must have been 6 hours. I was just about to cut the line and give up, and all of a sudden, I felt something break free. And I pulled, and I rode, and I cranked that thing, cranked that thing, cranked that thing. And it finally came up. You know what? It was just a lamp. I said, a lamp? That's not a fish story. He says, well, it kind of is. It had a little plate on it. It said Titanic. Old Bob Chandler just bowed his head because he had knowed he won. Now, as his son, I sat at the feet of these 3 guys, and at the time, I believed every word they said. I even asked my dad to show me that lamp. He says, when you grow up, boy, when you grow up. I believed those stories back in those days. I still want to believe them now, kind of. But you know what? They're not the only ones that tell fish stories. Sometimes Jesus gives us a couple of fish stories. And there are 2 marked, distinctive fish stories in this Bible. And to this day, theologians have a hard time trying to figure out why. We're going to talk about that a little bit this morning. I want you all to stand up one final time, stretch your legs.